to know CTPLS and its collaboration with everywhere overseas. And up next, we have our first keynote speech and of this conference, and it will be hosted by Professor Guan and presented by Professor Dana Powell, who came from the Appalachian State University in the USA, where she is an associate professor of anthropology. And she is now in Taiwan as the MOST visiting associate professor at the College of Indigenous Studies at National Donghua University. Let's welcome Professor Guan and Professor Powell.
Yes, thank you. I would like to introduce you Professor Donna Powell. She is from the Appalachian State University, and she is a very outstanding anthropologist. Her specializations include the social cultural anthropology, political ecology, environmental justice, and also the energy issue in the indigenous area. And she had a lot of very influential publication, including The Landscape of Power, the Politics of Energy in the Navajo Nations, that is published in 2017. And we are very lucky to have her in Taiwan because she got the sponsorship to come to Taiwan and being a visiting scholars in Donghua University. So we met a few weeks ago. We had very wonderful conversation, and I know that she is a very patient and also knowledgeable scholar. So we are lucky to have her to give us her talk today. And the topic of her talk is how to set the table, environmental justice, knowledge, and indigenous survivance in U.S. sacrifice zones. So let's welcome Donna. Please, Donna.
Good morning and good evening, friends all around the world. Thank you so much, Professor Guan Dawei. It's such an honor to join all of you this morning. And what I will do is share my screen and then say a few words of welcome and introduction before I begin. Let's see. Here we are. Are you able to see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know. So just a warm thank you, Daya, for your kind invitation to be with all of you this morning. And also I want to thank the whole team, Sayun, Joyce, everyone in the CTP-ILS office and team. You all have been fantastic in bringing me into this network. I also want to thank my colleagues in the College of Indigenous Studies here at National Donghua University who make it possible for me to be here, and Xie Rolan at the Center for International Indigenous Affairs, who is my formal host this year. Greetings to all of my friends and colleagues at UCLA, University of Hawaii, and Ifugao University in the Philippines. Some of you I have met, many of you I have not met, and look forward to these ongoing conversations. And this invitation to join you all this morning is so exciting for me. You know, I am a newcomer in some ways to this part of the world. So I'm here also as a student of Taiwan-Philippine relations and studies and Southeast Asian studies. So I hope that the remarks that I have to share today offer a kind of global comparative perspective that comes out of my 20 years of work as a non-native scholar, as an ally scholar with Indigenous social movements and Indigenous environmental justice movements in North America. So this invitation to give the opening keynote is a huge honor. It's also a very big responsibility. And I just want to say a couple words about that responsibility before I begin. As a non-Indigenous person, my scholarship and activism is constantly in a process of self-reflection. It's sort of an unfinished process of thinking about how we as non-native scholars that are also involved in this global movement to support and advance Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous self-determination, what is our role in this work? And that's a question that I think is always an open question. It's one that I answer through my teaching, through my scholarship, and through my relationships. Um, and I'm certainly very clear, as my Dene and other colleagues have taught me over the years, that Indigenous peoples speak for themselves in these matters. So my role here is not to speak for, but to speak with or to speak alongside. And I think that kind of shift for us as anthropologists, as ethnographers, as researchers, as engaged researchers, is something that's really worth dwelling on. And I hope that my work here in speaking with, and actually more accurately listening to, can help us think about a kind of collective, critical, decolonial set of methods, a decolonial methodology for how we go forward together in this work, to really bring Indigenous studies to the mainstream, to the center of the widest possible curriculum for everyone. So those are some of my motivations and some of my reasons and opportunities for being with you this morning. Thank you. So in the limited amount of time I have, and actually I would ask my colleagues if you would let me know when we have 5 or so minutes remaining, so I make sure I don't go over time. I want to invite you to think with me about how to set the table, environmental justice knowledge and Indigenous survivance in U.S. sacrifice zones. And I'll unpack some of these ideas as we go on. And I acknowledge the lands and peoples of where I sit today. I'm speaking to you from Hualien, actually specifically in Shofeng. I'm on the National Donghua University campus, and I recognize the homelands of all the Indigenous peoples of this territory. I just last week had the opportunity to visit Professor Guandawei's homelands in the beautiful Daian area of Hsinchu. And so I'm thinking about all of these regions across Taiwan that I'm getting to know. I'm also recognizing and thinking about Dinepikea, or the Navajo Nation, and the Dine people whose knowledge and whose teachings I'm able to share with you some today. So a lot of this work comes from walking in forests with my Dine friends and collaborators. This image gives you a little sense of the high alpine forests of the Navajo Nation. And a lot of my learning and a lot of my experience comes with being on the land, being in territory, often being in silence and sometimes being in conversation with my Dine teachers, like my friend here, Brooke Carroll. So part 1 of this talk is the sort of longer part. Part 2 is much shorter. And I want to talk a little bit about foundations of Dine environmental justice knowledge, which are territory. The foundations of this knowledge are rooted in place, in land, in territory. So there are a lot of different ways to make a map. And perhaps each of you with your own respective communities have different ways of envisioning and visualizing your place. In fact, when I was in Daian territory in Hsinchu earlier this week, I experienced the singing of a map as song. This map here is reflective of Dine or Navajo knowledge about place. And it is an orientation in 4 quadrants, as you can see, oriented starting with the white quadrant, the east, moving to the blue in the south, moving to the yellow in the west, and moving to the gray in the north. And I would draw your attention to see that each of the 4 quadrants for Dine knowledge, each of these 4 quadrants of Dine knowledge refers to a specific mountain. You see Hesperus Peak in the north, Blanca Peak in the east, Mount Taylor to the south, and the San Francisco Peaks to the west. Each quadrant corresponds to a particular shell, a particular color, a particular time of day. This is the basis of Dine knowledge of territory that's rooted in the 4 sacred mountains, which define Dine homeland. These mountains have been otherwise reflected. This is the map of the Navajo Nation. The image is a bit blurry, but perhaps you can see this was created in 1968 by a Dine artist, showing the way that Dine Ta, or Dine homeland, is held together by the rainbow and the deities who travel the rainbow. And this also shows you, if you see the darker brown rectangle kind of in the middle, That's the original 1868 treaty territory, which then is expanded over time into that lighter brown territory. But what I'm really interested in showing you in this image is the significance, again, of the 4 sacred mountains, each with a corresponding color to the east, the south, the west, and the north. And these mountains define and uphold Dene sovereignty and a sense of Dene homeland and knowledge that emerges from that territory. This, of course, is another way of making a map, more of a settler colonial sketch. This is marked by roads and interstate highways, waterways, rail lines. But this actually gives you a sense, if you look at the sort of inset map here, you can see where the Navajo Nation is within the United States of America in an area we call the Four Corners, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, those 4 states, come together. The Navajo Nation has a jurisdiction that overlaps those states. So the jurisdictional or legal overlaps are often quite complicated. For those of you here with me in Taiwan, I think it's striking to point out that the Navajo Nation is double the size of Taiwan and its outlying islands. So Navajo Nation is 70,000 square kilometers with roughly almost 300,000 enrolled citizens. About 190,000 of those people are living in the reservation. So it's quite staggering, isn't it, to compare this kind of geography with Taiwan, or certainly with the Philippines. We're talking about very different ecologies, very different demographics, very different territories. And yet, as I hope my talk will show, some pretty profound similarities. Dene social life is organized around 21 clans, and political life organized around 109 voting chapters, sort of local units of governance, which in some cases maintain a lot of autonomy for local decision-making, especially around land and land management, things like grazing rights for livestock and other forms of direct land management. You might notice in this image a kind of lighter tan area around Coal Canyon, Second Mesa. That's the Hopi Pueblo, the Hopi Nation, often called Hopi tribe, which is a completely separate native nation. Hopi and Dene people have very different histories, but through a sort of series of enclosures and land dispossessions and relocations, the Hopi tribe, this territory, falls within Navajo Nation. And some of you may have heard over the years of so-called conflict between Hopi and Dene people, which it's important for me to note has been fomented or has been manufactured by conflicts led by energy companies, by coal extraction companies, which put these two governments into conflict and at odds with one another in relation to leasing rights for minerals and subterranean resources, which I'll talk about a bit more. So I'd like to also invite you later on, we won't, we'll watch just the shortest bit now. This is a project run by Professor Sant at University of Georgia that shows the loss of 1.5 billion acres between 1776 and 1887. I share this map, which is kind of shows the sort of gradual dispossession of territory from 1776 onward, so that you can see how manifest destiny, that sort of ideology of Anglo settlement that spread from the US original 13 colonies into westward expansion, what that actually meant for loss of indigenous territory. So what you notice is as the blue is lost, that is the settler acquisition or the settler theft of indigenous territory, you start to see by the 1850s and the 1860s, and I'll pause at 1868, here we are, I'll pause. At 1868 is when the Navajo Nation on June 1st, 1868, makes a treaty with the United States government for the Dene people who had been incarcerated in a camp near modern-day Albuquerque, New Mexico, to return home. So this sort of small block here, that's the dark brown block you saw on the flag. This is the original reservation of 1868, which you'll notice as we continue expands a little bit over time. So what you're seeing here is the incredible and devastating loss of billions of acres of land. And by the 1890s, we can stop here, nothing much changes from the 1890s. A little bit of land adjustments are made kind of in the New Deal era in the US in the 1930s, but there are no significant changes after the 19th century. So what remains is a sort of patchwork of reservations, which are of course just a remainder of original indigenous land. And I pause on this to emphasize that the dispossession and the loss of land is a core concern for indigenous environmental justice. This loss of 1.5 billion acres of land was sort of secured in 1887 with what's called the Dawes Act in United States federal policy in relation to Indian people. Indian land for sale. This was a very common advertisement in the newspapers in the late 1880s, early 1990s. The Dawes Act allowed the United States of America's federal government to break up and sell indigenous lands. So to shift territory out of a commons or a collective and into individual property rights led by male heads of household. So there was a gender implication in this as well. In many indigenous nations, land rights and land management was passed through matrilineal or through women, through matrilineal kinship. The Dawes Act reorganized individual land rights and property rights in a European model of a male head of household. This enabled assimilation by dispossession. So the goal here was to break up the commons, break up the collectives, privatize and individualize land holdings, and then also transform those households into a white or settler model of farming as a way of assimilating indigenous peoples. So let's return then to a specific territory, and a territory that I've come to know very well over 2 decades of work here. It's been such an honor and privilege to get to work and live in Navajo Nation. The Colorado Plateau is a sort of name term from geology that helps us understand this sort of high desert ecology of the US Southwest. And the Colorado Plateau is overlays with the Dene Reservation, which is also Dene homeland. Unlike many of the Native nations from the US Southeast and other areas, the Dene were not removed and relocated to new territory. After they were incarcerated between 1864 and 1868, they took what is called and painfully remembered as a long walk home back to their original homelands. The surface ecology of the Colorado Plateau, as you can see in these images, is high deserts in some areas like Monument Valley, which is the desert image you see on the left, and then high alpine forests. I took this picture on the right. These are the forests that I used to walk in all the time, and the sheep that I knew very well in the home where I lived for 2 years in the Chusca Mountains. The subsurface ecology below the surface, beyond what the eye can see, is intensely rich with energy minerals. So the Colorado Plateau is one of the richest reserves of coal, uranium, oil, and natural gas in North America. So yet another map that helps us understand that. I've tinkered with this map a little bit to show you where I've circled in red. You can see really active coal mining and coal processing sites around the reservation. These are not all of them, just the large scale ones. The yellow shows you generally the sites of uranium extraction. So uranium was removed during the US Cold War for the production of nuclear weapons. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So the yellow sites show uranium. And then I've circled 3 of the 4 sacred mountains. So you can see still this kind of tension between, you can see a tension here between a landscape defined by sacred mountains and a kind of environmental knowledge that has to do with the social practice and long land tenure in this place, with a kind of transforming sense of the landscape, which has been transformed through intensive extraction of energy minerals, which started in the early 20th century, in the 1920s. So environmental injustice, as many of you are surely aware, is a sort of wide literature, a very broad set of social movements that help us make sense of some of these kinds of maps and images and histories. And a kind of general definition is the disproportionate or uneven siting of hazardous wastes and other environmental risks and harms, such as factories, landfills, power plants, in low-income communities of color. And this articulation of environmental racism emerged from the African-American and Indigenous-led civil rights and Red Power movements in the 1960s and 1970s in the US. It was further consolidated in one of the most important documents of this social movement, and I invite all of you to explore this on your own. You can just Google search Environmental Justice 17 Principles, and you'll get this whole set of principles here. This was written in 1991 at the National People of Color Leadership Summit held in Washington, D.C., which was an incredibly diverse assemblage of 300 or more delegates. There were delegates there from the Marshall Islands and the South Pacific, and other delegates from Guam and this greater Southeast Asian Pacific region who were there, who met over several days to articulate core principles of environmental justice. And you can see here in principle number 1 that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. So there was, from its earliest enunciation, from these earliest principles, a sense of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous experience that infused these principles. These were rights-based affirmations, and this set of principles also posed a theoretical and an empirical challenge to mainstream environmentalism. Why? Well, because mainstream environmentalism in the US and in many places in North America and around the world had been preoccupied with wilderness conservation, the establishment of national parks, with a sort of politics of nature that kept nature as something pristine and outside of human experience. So these principles, of course, show the radical interdependence of human life, multi-species, and what we might call nature in English, and articulates a politics of rights-based access and healthy living. And although these were written in 1991, I use these principles in my teaching all the time with my students in the US, and it's always remarkable to realize how relevant and pertinent they are so many years later. In fact, last year we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of these principles. So with these principles, the kind of original definition of environmental justice changes, doesn't it? Environmental justice becomes modified to emphasize the effects of settler colonialism and long-standing land relations. Or in the words of Potawatomi scholar activist Kyle White at University of Michigan, Kyle White writes, environmental justice is an ecology of US settler colonial erasure. So we start to see environmental injustices as part and parcel of this long-term process of the dispossession of land and estrangement from territory. Land loss through forced relocation and removal, land contamination from development projects, and cultural assimilation projects that target Indigenous knowledges, estranging or distancing Indigenous peoples from territory. So this kind of critical settler colonial analysis helps us see a mode or a practice of environmental injustice that wasn't always clear before. Sacrifice zones are one of the ways in which Indigenous environmental justice has made clear the projects of US empire, both in North America and in this part of the world and Southeast Asia, through the determination of certain lands and certain peoples as potentially expendable, for the expansion of US empire. So this is a framework that helps us think critically about this merger that Kyle White is asking us to see of settler colonialism and environmental injustice. So these sites of industrial caused air and water pollution far exceed allowable limits, and that's in the words of the US EPA. This term was first used in the 1970s. It was used by academics and used by activists to talk about what was happening in the American West in the face of coal strip mining, intensive coal extraction that rendered the land, and by extension, the people for whom this land was their source of livelihood, rendered it a sacrificial zone, kind of deadened zone. The Western Shoshone Nation in the US is often cited as one of these intensive sacrifice zones. The entire state of Nevada is traditional homelands of the Western Shoshone. And one of the former leaders, Ian Zabarte, often speaks of the Shoshone Territory as the most bombed nation on earth due to the Nevada nuclear weapons test site. And I think the same could be said of some of the Marshall Islands and other territories in the South Pacific. So how do we develop a kind of transnational critical indigenous theory of these sacrifice zones, and then what it means to build sustainability going forward through self-determination? Returning to the Navajo Nation, in the Navajo Nation and Diné territories, 30% of households in the Navajo Nation lack running water. Another 30% of households lack electricity. And those statistics and numbers are not ones that I invented. They actually come to us from the tribe itself, from the Navajo Nation's Tribal Utility Authority, and legal scholars and attorneys on Navajo Nation that study this infrastructural lack quite carefully. And yet, this is kind of the conundrum, or this is the contradiction. With this kind of lack of infrastructure, we also see some of North America's richest deposits of energy minerals beneath the surface of the Colorado Plateau. Legally, Navajo Nation controls these energy mineral resources, but because all indigenous lands, reservation lands in the US, are held in trust by the United States government, that means the federal or settler government holds title still to those lands. There are sort of intensive entanglements of colonialism that make the Navajo Nation, for example, need to go through the United States National Environmental Policy Act and through US federal law to engage in mineral extraction or protection on those territories. There have been a number of ways that this gets imaged. This is a cartoon from a very well-known Diné cartoonist, Jack Hastine. I admire his work so much. In this cartoon, which he made in 2008, we have a Diné farmer saying, "No water for farms, no electricity for our houses. Some things never change." And he's saying this against the backdrop of these transmission lines. You can see the huge electrical the power lines behind him carrying electricity produced from Navajo coal, carrying it off the reservation to places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, the wider urban Southwest. We also see a pipeline, the New Mexico Navajo Gallup water supply. This was a project in those years, in 2007, 2008, 2009, to take the very precious water resources from the San Juan River, which is a major river in northern New Mexico, and pipe it all the way through the Navajo Nation to the city of Gallup, New Mexico, for urban consumers in Gallup to use this water, but without any distribution to the farms or the needs of Navajo Nation. So there's a way in which this energy infrastructure, electricity, uranium, water, is part of the backdrop of Diné experience, while Diné people have remained very much at the margins of becoming consumers or users of their own resources. It's a pretty common experience for Navajo families to have to drive maybe up to 2 or 3 hours with a big pickup truck like this, full of these tanks, to fill with water. The intensive contamination from uranium mining has made lots of water sources unusable. They are contaminated by uranium's tailing piles. So knowing where good, safe water is a kind of local knowledge for survival that is absolutely critical. Families know where to go to get good, safe drinking water for their families, for their animals. And this costs a tremendous amount of gas, a tremendous amount of time and energy and effort and labor to gather water in tanks like this and then drive it all the way back home for use at home. And this is increasingly difficult in a time of climate change where the US Southwest and this high desert ecology has been experiencing an unprecedented drought. So the increasing dryness has also dried up or done away with many of the water sources that people have depended upon. So we'll meet now one of my closest collaborators over the years. I've had the great privilege to work with Mr. Earl Tooley, who is one of the directors of the Navajo Housing Authority. He knows a tremendous amount about infrastructure and housing and the environment and the land in Navajo Nation. He also is a founding member of the group Diné Care, Diné Citizens Against Ruining Our Environment, and has had a career as an environmental justice activist. Here you see him visiting with an elderly relative in a hogan, or a traditional Diné house. This is a very traditional sort of mud-built house. In the previous image, you can see one in the distance built from logs. That's more common today to see the log construction, but this is a more traditional one that happens to fall within Monument Valley National Park. So Earl over the years has told me a story that just stays with me. And I would invite all of you to think about the stories from your elders and your relatives and your friends and colleagues that stay with you. On page 15 of my book, Landscapes of Power, I tell this story. So I recount it here with Earl's permission, with his family's permission. And it's published in the book. Although when I went back to my book to review for our talk, I realized that this story is so much richer, and it becomes richer for me over the years. When he was a young child in the 1960s, his parents sent him away from the Navajo Nation to live with an English-speaking white family, a Mormon family in central Arizona, so that, in his mother's words, you would become our translator. He lived there for over a decade. When he was 21, he returned home for a visit. He came home to see his family, and he'd come back and forth over the years, but this was a particularly memorable visit for him. He came home as an adult to find that his mother had acquired a table for their small hogan and had arranged a place setting for him to eat with a plate, a fork, a knife, and a single chair, a chair only for him to sit in at that table, while she, his mother, his father, and his siblings sat and ate on the floor in the customary Diné style. She wanted me to feel at home, said Earl. We sent you away so you could learn how to move between worlds, his mother said. Earl has shared this story with me time and time again, and I use it as kind of a framing story for my talk today. That's the how to set the table piece of the title, to invite us to think about how, as we examine Indigenous knowledge for environmental justice and sustainability, there are these kinds of stories that stay with us that suggest how knowledge is adaptable, how it's dynamic, and how it's related to much wider kind of global shifts, which is what I'll talk about next. Earl's mother was acutely aware of the kind of mid-20th century transitions and translations, the need to move between worlds that was happening really from the end of World War II onward in the Navajo Nation. The United States military enlisted a group of Diné or Navajo soldiers as code talkers in the years of 1942 to 1945 during the war to create what became an unbreakable code. It was never deciphered by the Japanese. It was a military code based on the Diné language, which is incredibly difficult. And it engendered kind of alternative patriotism. So there's a way in which Dene people, when they speak of territory, when they speak of the defense of land, and they speak about the meaning of land, will often invoke the code talkers and World War II as a moment of acquiring, or in Earl Tully's words, he said, Dene Ta, our land really opened up after World War II, and code talkers are a huge part of how Dene territory becomes understood differently after that time. World War II is also, in addition to the code talkers, this is the moment where uranium mining for the nuclear weapons arsenal, which drove the Cold War between the United States of America and the USSR from the end of World War II until the disintegration of the USSR in 1990, we have this era that we generally call the Cold War. This is driven by the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. 4 million tons of uranium was mined from the Colorado Plateau. Geologists estimate another 70 million tons is still there. So the Grants Uranium Belt, as it's called, the Grants Uranium Belt is this very rich geological deposit of uranium that runs all through New Mexico, underneath Dene homeland, and also the homeland of many Pueblo peoples, especially the Laguna. The Laguna Pueblo, which is just outside current-day Albuquerque, New Mexico, had the largest open pit uranium mine in the world. So this is the site of extraction for US nuclearism. Following nuclear extraction, coal mining really intensified in the 1960s and has continued to intensify until the present. Only in just the last few years, like the last 5 years, have we started to see some of these major 1960s era coal-fired power plants start to come apart. My book, Landscapes of Power, tells one story of a contested coal-fired power plant and how indigenous knowledge and social movements responded to the intensification of coal. The coal reserves under Native nations are vast in North America, and this continues to be a major point of debate for what self-determination should look like in the 21st century. Here we see Mr. Tully with the elder Mr. Tully, his father, from the World War II era in a parade in Navajo Nation a few years ago. World War II opened up the world for Dene Ta, says Earl. And his father, who didn't have more than a 6th grade education, spoke very little English, was among these veterans in World War II who helped redefine Dene territory. Here's one of my other anthropologist teachers, Mr. Harry Walters, Dene anthropologist, who directed the museum at Dene College for many, many years. Here we are taking a walk in Cove, Utah, and he's showing me in this picture naturally occurring uranium, which just is often turned up now by storms and other kind of forms of natural erosion. So it's all around. Here, Earl is showing us a sign. He's showing me a sign in the Dene language and in English that shows a warning of radiation contamination from an abandoned uranium mine in his home community of Blue Gap in the central Navajo Nation. Today, there are close to 270 unreclaimed uranium tailing sites across the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation tribal government has made some strides towards cleanup, but really lacks the overall capacity to do a full-scale cleanup. So this remains a really pressing issue of environmental injustice. And of course, uranium is naturally occurring. It occurs with vanadium. These are split in the processing, and uranium is processed into plutonium, which is the core of nuclear weapons. Coal became intensely debated in the early 2000s with the proposal of new coal-fired power plants. And these images here are images from my own couple years of intensive field work related to coal extraction. The Doda Desert Rock Resistance was a set of social practices, a local social movement, which gained global attention because it emerged shortly or not long after Facebook and other social media platforms became widely available. So there were young Dene activists who were resisting this new coal-fired power plant, who made the struggle of their mothers and their grandmothers. This was a movement primarily led by elderly women. Why? Because elderly women in the matrilineal kinship system within Navajo Nation are primarily responsible for land management and had the strongest voice in wanting to stop the development of additional coal-powered facilities. So I spent a lot of time in this period of research looking at how federal environmental policy through the National Environmental Policy Act, things like environmental impact statements, failed to adequately address local knowledge and indigenous knowledge of this territory, which was very much at stake and very much in risk, put at risk by these additional energy infrastructures. And so this Dene energy justice movement started to show me and show all of us that I was working with how these public debates over science and technology, over tribal and federal policy related to energy and environment, were also much deeper philosophical battles over how to do self-determination and sovereignty, how indigenous self-determination should be practiced. What is the social practice for autonomy in the 21st century? The foundations of Dene environmental justice are territory, returning to this sort of core theme of my talk, both as sacred Dene homeland within the 4 sacred mountains, and also as a sacrifice zone for US global empire and urban modernization. Here's an image of Ms. Marcella Tooley, Earl's mother, the mother who sent him away to live with the English-speaking family in central Arizona so that he could become their translator and move between worlds. She was a deep, deep knowledge keeper about Dene medicines. She used to write about gathering kota, this is sometimes called Navajo tea, for medicine, for tea, and for dyeing wool, for weaving. And it was an area of her knowledge which was very deep. And with her passing, some of that knowledge is held within the family and some of it is lost. So Ms. Tooley remains, I think, for all of us, a reminder of the urgency of this kind of work that all of you are engaged in. This kind of know-how for sustainability, knowing how to set the table, then, indexes for us not only a mother's care, but an adaptation of knowledges that really, in my opinion, cannot be reduced to cultural assimilation. That would be too easy of an analysis to say that she set the table as a kind of method of cultural assimilation. I think there's something much more significant going on here. Ms. Tooley, who never spoke English, never lived outside the reservation in her nearly 100 years of life, was part of an entire generational shift of Dene people that understood that Dene homeland was at stake, that mid-century modernization of the United States Southwest depended upon being subsidized by Dene land, labor, and resources. This is a way of surviving and responding, of becoming resilient to these kinds of global influences. So in my final few minutes of remarks, I want to talk a little bit about how this kind of knowledge is mobilized and how an environmental justice as sovereignty-centered sustainability might help us in our 2 days together think about the role of Indigenous self-determination in sustainability projects. I draw extensively in my own work from an Indigenous scholar, Darren Renko, anthropologist at University of Maine and member of the Penobscot Nation, in how environmental justice in the tribal context cannot be contemplated apart from a recognition of American Indian tribes' unique historical, political, and legal circumstances. This 2-day conference here is such a diverse gathering of Indigenous peoples from the Philippines, from Taiwan, from across Southeast Asia, and beyond, that this statement from Renko should be considered in light of everyone's own unique historical, political, and cultural circumstances. Indigenous peoples have very different kinds of relationship to settler states and to states. Renko here is talking very specifically about the US context. I'm certainly aware of that. So you would want to think about this in terms of the peculiar and particular relations of indigenous peoples to settler states in different contexts. But the key takeaway here is that existing as a distinct sovereign within the boundaries of a settler state is something that has to be considered in any theory and social practice of environmental justice for indigenous peoples. Other scholars and activists that have helped me think about this over the years, the work of Winona LaDuke, Anishinaabe economist, ecologist, founder of non-governmental organizations like Honor the Earth and the White Earth Land Recovery Project. I invite you to Google both of those and read more about their work for land back movements, the reacquisition of land, food, and seed saving projects. There's a tremendous amount of social practice within this very widespread indigenous environmental justice movement. And I have learned greatly from Winona over 20 years. I also learned greatly from my Dene activists. And as I move towards closing, I'll just point here to a few of the artists, activists, and intellectuals that I've been thinking with in my research, in my collaborative research, about how we understand a sovereignty-centered sustainability. This is Gloria Emerson, one of my teachers, Dene elder, here at the San Juan River, describing to me the kind of riparian or ecological changes that she's noticed since her own childhood. She's also a well-known poet and artist. She painted this work on the left in 2008, around the time that we were all engaged in this movement to stop a new coal-fired power plant. The coal-fired power plant was called Desert Rock. And here you see her kind of inverting those words, naming her piece Rock Desert, to ask all of us, to ask mostly her fellow Dene citizens, what kind of territory they want to live in into the future. Another artist and environmental justice activist who I work closely with is Ed Singer of the Cameron chapter. He's in a completely different area of Navajo Nation. Gloria Emerson is along the San Juan River in northern New Mexico. Ed Singer lives very close to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And he led a major social practice project to establish a commercial scale wind power farm in his community, and has remained very active in local movements for wind energy and for renewable energy as a kind of counterpoint to the intensive fossil fuel extraction that's gone on in his homeland. His painting here on the left, Dear Downwinders, shows us a kind of rendition or interpretation of the impacts of nuclearism and nuclear fallout from the Nevada test site. And third, my colleagues Makai Lewis and Kim Smith, who are citizen scientist activists who've been engaged in collecting health data, surveying Dene people about their health in relation to changing climate conditions, but also to the large-scale coal and energy infrastructures in their area. And this is a food truck that they outfitted with traditional Navajo foods. They would hitch it up to their truck and go around a 100-mile radius within these coal-fired power plants in this one community near Shiprock, New Mexico, gathering data on people's lived experiences of health. Away from Navajo Nation, I had the great opportunity to travel with Earl Tooley and other Dene colleagues to spend some time in the resistance camps to the Dakota Access Pipeline, which in 2016 and 2017 really captured global attention within Indigenous studies and among Indigenous activists and others. Energy Transfer Partners is a huge energy corporation, which was working through a series of leases enabled by the United States government to build a 1,200 pipeline from the Bakken crude oil all the way down to Illinois and onto the Gulf of Mexico. So this 10-month occupation in this territory assembled over 10,000 people. In fact, it grew to be so large that it was the 7th largest city in North Dakota at the time. with all of the people from all over the world. The key point here is the way in which sovereignty and self-determination, the ability of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation to assert treaty rights and their self-determination as an indigenous nation over their territories, their lands, and their waters in treaties that were signed by the US government in the 19th century was centrally what was at stake in this issue. So this was certainly a movement, a social movement about environmental justice. The pipeline route originally would have gone through the capital city of Bismarck, but the governor rerouted it to move it through so-called open or remote territory. But as you can see from the map, it comes right next to the Standing Rock Reservation. So this becomes Kyle White's excellent article on the Dakota Access Pipeline shows us yet again a kind of extension of settler colonialism as disruption of environmental knowledge and relations, and these enact various forms of erasure. In North Dakota, in Standing Rock Sioux territory, this was certainly seen as a social movement which would allow no spiritual surrender. It was a prayerful movement. It was a movement of ceremony and a movement of water protection that made it very clear that Indigenous self-determination had to be at the center of any settlement or of any peacemaking efforts towards sustainability. So in conclusion, just to pull some of these threads together and to invite conversation both now and for the coming 2 days, environmental justice knowledge for Indigenous survival and resilience, a word we might call survivance, and I borrow that from Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Weisenor, is not only about stopping contamination from industrial harms or climate change harms, but is also about restoring relationships to territory. Social movements, engaged scholars, artists, and activists show us self-determination and land relations are central for redefining both justice and sustainability. I think we have an incredible opportunity this weekend together to do some of this work, to think about how, here in this image by my friend James Joe, this amazing Dene artist, how we think about temporalities, past, present, future, perhaps not in a linear form, in a kind of Western or Eurocentric way of thinking about time, but in circular forms. How do we bring together sovereignty-centered self-determination and sovereignty-centered sustainability to think about the long term of Indigenous survivance? Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any dialogue that we can have now or going forward.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you for the very informative and also very inspiring speech. I personally, very touched by your talk, especially, when you gave the story of Earl, that he was sent to the school outside the reservation. I was sent to the elementary school out of my village when I was very young. So I totally can understand the feeling and also the obligation to bridge the two worlds. And I also, very, agree with your opinion that it's not just about assimilation. It's a struggle, but also adaptation, and also, a movement to try to educate the descendant of settlers, and also maybe further, deconstruct the dichotomy between colonized and colonizers. So I think that's the mission of all of us, us in the network. So I also, highly inspired by the example that the artists, the practitioners, the scholars work together, try to, work out all these efforts. So I personally do have some questions for you, but also I would like to open the floor because we have many good friends here, colleagues, and also young scholars. Here you see Yi Yu Lai, Larry. Larry is a young anthropologist now study in the PhD program in University of Hawaii. And also I see we have like James is a PhD student in NCCU. We have Hao Ci, she is an anthropologist and now a faculty in NCCU. We have Professor Lin Yiren. I believe you already met him. He is also online, and Luo Shumei. She is also an anthropologist, and she will be the moderator of our next panel. So I personally, I have some question, like, it's very difficult, but not impossible, of course, to deconstruct the dichotomy between colonized and colonizer. And that's very important things. But also very often we see the resistance or the mainstream society, the opinions, public opinions. I mean, in the case in United States, do they see the effort of the movement or the effort of the struggle in the network? Do they try, gradually, learn from all this movement? For the mainstream society. And I'm also curious about, like, in Taiwan, there's a situation that for this kind of energy company, they will give subsidy or compensation to the community. So in this way, you will kind of make the community feel that they were compensated, and they will allow the mining or all this energy plantation to continue their work there. Does that also happen? And how do people deal with that? And also we know that in United States, you have the reservation, you have the autonomy of indigenous government. So what's the role of indigenous government play in these issues? That's my questions. So maybe we can also open the floor to all the audience, and we can collect some question or maybe comment or response, and then you can answer to them. Okay. Okay. So
that would be lovely. Thank you. I've made a note of all of your questions. I'll be happy to respond.
Great. So anyone would like to give you a comment or response or maybe question? Larry?
Yeah. First of all, I want to really thank for your keynote speech. It's really inspired. And I don't really have any like questions, but just like kind of like feedback. I really like what you say in the end, like when you say that like the sustainability it's about like restoring relationship to territory. And I feel that like this is really important for lots of indigenous people to really think about, like when we talk about like energy development. So I'm just like curious, like maybe you can share a little bit, like how do like indigenous people in your field trying to like echo with this kind of like goal? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So maybe we can collect one more comment or question, then Donna, you can try to give your feedback. Oh, I see a new friends here, Zhang Shennan. Would you like to say something?
Sure. So thank you for Professor's talk. It's really inspiring. So I'm a PhD candidate from University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm a Taiwanese. And so, yeah, just a brief question. So so when you talk about the dichotomy between settlers and the settled, I was thinking about the diversity between the settlers, or how could we provincialize the majority of the settlers so that we can have another way to make alliance or to think about the dichotomy, this kind of dichotomy in a different way. And do you have any ideas about this? Thank you.
Very good question. So Donna, please.
Thank you so much for these rich and exciting questions. I wish we had more time. I'll do my very best. I think what I might do is actually start with Larry's question, if that's all right, and then circle back through all of them, because I think it offers a way to start with kind of some empirical examples. It's a great question, Larry. You asked me, how are people in my field doing this work of restoring relations? So that seems really important for sustainability. So that sustainability isn't just about, building new kinds of hardware, right? But it's about restoring relations in this sort of broader sense of dispossession, right, of colonial dispossession. And there are a few scholars who are Indigenous scholars whose work is really dedicated to this. Leanne Simpson's work on land as pedagogy is great. So a lot of this is happening through education. And I think that that's an exciting thing for us to think about, given the directive or the mission, the kind of tripartite mission of this center, for which education collaboratives and maybe thinking about how do we decolonize, educational projects. So some of it is doing different kinds of schools, different kinds of education that's dedicated to that restoration of relationships, that both, I think, gets kids and adults, all of us, right? We all need re-education, out on the land, but also thinking about different sources of authoritative teaching, right? So kind of decentering the canon, decentering the way we think education should be done. So there's a lot, the journal Decolonization, Education and Society publishes a lot on this. Leanne Simpson's work is great. In terms of anthropologists, or I love the work. I mean, he's not technically an anthropologist, though I embrace him as my Cherokee Nation colleague, Clint Carroll at UC Boulder. Clint and I have been in a very lively discussion for well over a decade about what kind of Indigenous political ecologies look like, with a much wider group of colleagues. And his work in Cherokee Nation, his book called Roots of Our Renewal, which is on Cherokee ethnobotany, looks at how relations, I think this work is brilliant because Cherokee Nation was one of the so-called 5 civilized tribes that were forcibly removed from Georgia and the Carolinas to so-called Indian country, to Oklahoma. So part of the project for Cherokee Nation was to restore relations with territory that was not homeland territory. Right. So Clint is looking with elders very critically and carefully at how do we restore relations in new territory, like after the outcome of forced removal, when you're not going back to the original territory, right? You're in new territory, and how this work is being done through relationships with plants and other species is kind of central in Clint's work. And so he has worked with a group of elders and medicine keepers and knowledge keepers that have very actively worked to establish this kind of 20th century, 21st century Cherokee relationality in Oklahoma, which is very aware of that forced and violent removal, the forced removal to new territory, but the need to restore relations in that new site. So I think that's a very kind of sophisticated and complex look at territory, right? As I tried to note, Dene Nation is a little bit different in that although Dene people were removed, they were returned to their original homelands. That is certainly not the case, as you all know very well, for many, many, many Indigenous peoples worldwide. So how do we restore relations to territory when displacement and forced and violent removal is part of that experience? I think Clint Carroll's work really offers some guidance in that. And then among activists, the work around food is incredible. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project, which I mentioned, which is on the White Earth Ojibwe or Anishinaabe territory in northern Minnesota, they are one example. There's a buffalo or bison, American bison restoration project in Montana and in the Great Plains. These community-driven, indigenous-led projects to restore particular foodways, indigenous foodways, which we all know is much more about eating. It's about eating, it's about sociality, but it's also about restoring relations through knowledge and through specific kinds of interspecies relationships. So that is also a place that I take a lot of inspiration and where I think that people are doing this work really creatively. And they're doing it mindful of these sort of processes of colonialism that rendered these species nearly extinct, right? Or that rendered these relationships, that disrupted these relationships and these knowledges. Professor Daya, I'll ask, respond to a couple of your questions, which is really about kind of the role of governments, the role of energy companies, some of the mechanics of how that works, and then the optics of mainstream society in seeing what's going on here. The role of Indigenous governments is incredibly complicated. And, you know, the Navajo Nation has been an energy resource-rich nation for decades. And the tribal government has, in general, been pro-extraction, pro-fossil fuel extraction. So this creates a complicated situation. In the case of the Desert Rock Energy Project that I write about in my book, and a lot of coal-fired power plants, Navajo Nation leadership has very much been pro-coal, pro-extraction. So they have been challenged by citizen-based movements, right? By their own tribal citizens, by Indigenous Dene people who don't want to see economic development follow that fossil fuel pathway, would like to see different things done. But there are also people within the tribal government that are critical of, so it's very dynamic. It's difficult to paint a kind of and I think this is to your point also about deconstructing these dichotomies. It's very complex and very messy, kind of in practice. I think that's one thing we know as ethnographers and anthropologists, and just as human beings, right? When we attend to what's actually going on in practice on the ground, it's very complicated. Which is to say, so for example, my close collaborator, Earl Tooley, has both worked within the tribal government for the housing authority. At the same time, he was one of the founders and most outspoken resistors of a lot of his own government's energy policies, right? The government that he works for, right? And is also a citizen. So there are people, and Mr. Tooley actually ran for president of Navajo Nation at one point in his career. So it's a much more dynamic field of environmental governance and relationality than I see in so-called mainstream US society. Some of this has to do with clan relations, right? Some of it has to do with the deep sense of relationality that people have to one another, the kind of clan obligations that exist. And we're talking very small numbers, right? I told you Navajo Nation is double the size of Taiwan in terms of the land base, but with only about 200,000 people that are there. So these kinds of conflicts play out in very intimate ways. So there are a number of Indigenous governments that are pro-fossil fuel development and are contested by their citizens. The case of Standing Rock, I think, is really interesting. And if I didn't have time to really give you that whole story, but just wanted to signal it, because to your question, Professor Daya, about does mainstream US society see these movements? When 10,000 people showed up in these resistance camps by November, December of 2016, this energy justice, environmental justice, indigenous movement was absolutely on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Guardian. You know, this was global news. And so if we want to speak of mainstream US society, that's a very generic term, but non-native, general mainstream society, who probably could not have found the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation on a map if asked. This was just sort of rural Dakotas, became aware that there was a treaty-centered, self-determination-centered movement underway, in the US that had global attention. So I think things have increasingly, Standing Rock was a real a watershed moment for the kind of visibility of indigeneity and energy justice and environmental justice in the wider society. So that's one way I would respond to that. Certainly in the Southwest, I think these issues are are quite visible for most people within the Southwest, although it's entirely possible, to live in the city of Phoenix as a kind of bourgeois, middle to upper class lifestyle in Phoenix, and never ask where the energy is coming from for your swimming pool and your air conditioners, right? It's coming from Navajo coal. It's coming from Navajo Nation. So there is still certainly a disjuncture between the sites of extraction and the knowledge at the sites of consumption. That's for sure. And I think that this overall question about deconstructing the dichotomy between colonizer and colonized is also related to the last question from the last question as well, about provincializing settlers, right? To kind of rethink the settler. How do we deconstruct this? I am looking at this vibrant group of young PhD scholars and others here to help us do that. I think a lot of, and I'll speak here in kind of a theoretical register, like I think a lot has been gained from the critical settler colonial studies kind of analytic. It's incredibly useful. It also allows us to do comparative work across places like Taiwan, New Zealand, Aotearoa, North America, Israel, Palestine. We can see things with this framework that we couldn't see before. And it's incredibly useful. It can have, and I say this as an ethnographer, it can have a kind of flattening effect. And it can have a kind of dichotomizing effect. So for example, another site where I have a project is in Eastern North Carolina, in the kind of lowland, swampland areas along the coast of North Carolina, where I work with Indigenous environmental justice activists who are Lumbee Indigenous peoples, but also African-American communities. And the African-American and Black leadership there is incredibly strong. And so if we want to deconstruct the dichotomy between colonizer and colonized, I think it happens empirically in social practices. I think when we attend to places like rural Eastern North Carolina, the coastal Atlantic plain, where I see Indigenous, African-American, Latinx, and Anglo, and immigrant, there's a huge population of Hmong and other of Hmong immigrants in that area. This is an incredibly diverse area of rural Eastern North Carolina. It doesn't get us so far to stick with that dichotomy of colonizer and colonized, because we have to reckon with histories of the enslavement of peoples of African descent. We have to talk about immigration and migration of people from Latin America, who now call that area home. Hmong immigrants from Laos, who now are farmers in some of the big industrial poultry and hog operations in that area. So I think as students and professors and activists of these projects, we have to always attend to the social practices and to the empirical, because that, I think, will always complicate and provincialize the settlers, right? Will help us see these sort of dynamic histories that are entangled, so that this theoretical framework of settler colonial studies, the settler and the colonized, is useful in many ways, but can actually, I think, accidentally create some erasures of other kinds of experience that we want to really bring in. And I'm really excited to hear your questions, because I can see that you all are doing that deep and kind of complicated thinking already. So thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you so much, Donna. You know, I would like to once again thank you. That it's very inspiring, and you make me confirm that, you know, connecting or networking the community globally is one very important thing. And also, I know that a lot of our elder generation, they already made their efforts to do this kind of work. And I think we should continue this effort to network each other. Because of limitation of the time, I believe we have to stop here. But luckily, Donna will be with us for all these 2 days, right? So we can continue our dialogue, our conversation in following sections. And once again, thank you so much. Thank you, Donna. And I'm going to hand it over to Pinjun. I believe we should continue to next panels, right? So Pinjun, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Guan and Professor Dana.